to today's video. Today is Sunday, September 1st, 2024. Happy September and happy 65 days until the November 5th, 2024 presidential election. We are 65 days out, 2 months out from the general election, and today I'm going to be showing you my updated 2024 election prediction between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. Today we're taking a look at an electoral map that really has changed dramatically over the past year, fluctuating between a Democratic and Republican victory, especially with two different candidates for president on the Democratic side, with Joe Biden up until July 21st, and now Vice President Harris, who has since taken the reins and won over the Democratic electorate and officially has been nominated as recently as the Democratic National Convention. Now, this map is my first prediction since the convention, so my prediction from earlier on in August, took place on August 15th, was released about a few days before the convention had taken place. And what we had known historically is that candidates often receive a bump after the convention that takes place for their political party. In 2016, Donald Trump took himself from being below the average and under Hillary Clinton to leading nationwide at the end of July after his convention. Then Hillary Clinton had her convention and she resumed her lead nationwide. In 2020, we saw that both Biden and Trump saw marginal improvements, but still a level of improvement on the national scale when it came down to the conventions. But recently, in 2024, we haven't seen much of a bump for either side of the aisle. Back when Trump was faced against Biden, he didn't see much of a convention bump until we saw in the immediate aftermath when Joe Biden dropped out of the race, it pretty much halted any and all of the bumps that we could have seen for former President Trump. And so when Kamala Harris took over as the Democratic nominee, it really went to show that not only did Donald Trump not improve off his margin of victory over Biden, but against Vice President Harris, he was losing to her on the national level. But now we're not really seeing the level of a convention bump that we saw in 2008 or even 2012 or arguably even in 2016. It seems as if this election has largely become stagnant since the last time we made a prediction. And although I'll be adjusting some of my ratings today, we are largely in a very similar place when it comes down to the eventual winner of the election, besides the fact that the election in many ways has started to narrow up ever so slightly. And while I do think this election is just going to be decided by a handful of states, we do have to spend time characterizing what we determine to be safe states. These are all the states right now that I'm characterizing, either red or blue, that we know no matter what, no matter who the nominee is, no matter what national circumstances, these states and these districts will undoubtedly go to the Democratic and Republican nominees. Democrats start out with 181 electoral votes. Republicans start out with just a bit less, which we can characterize on this map here. But regardless, what we find is that the overall electoral map here is very much anyone's game, right? Historically speaking, we've seen arguments from the left and the right that the Electoral College favors one side of the aisle over the other. But what we've seen in recent years is that genuinely the Electoral College, while may benefit Republicans in that they don't need to do as well in the national popular vote in order to win, it's still very much a toss-up strategy and a toss-up game for both sides of the aisle. Looking at our electoral map right now, Republicans start out with roughly 107 safe electoral votes. Now, this is a bit misleading because there are some states on this map that we know undoubtedly will go to the Republican Party. But in terms of margin, right now are competitive in a way that means Kamala Harris could lose these states better than Joe Biden did. And I know that sounds crazy to say losing a state better, but it means narrowing down the state from what might have been Trump plus 13 to Trump plus 12. Or if it's anywhere between the 5 to 15 point range, meaning it's a pretty solid Republican state, but Donald Trump's only going to win it by 14.5. It still deserves a likely characterization because we try to keep things consistent around here. And so that means states like Kansas. Now we're going to see the introduction of the likely characterization on the map here. Kansas and South Carolina, and arguably even Alaska, states that we know the Republican Party, again, more likely than not, going to win these states. And even in extenuating circumstances, it would be difficult to see how some of these go to the Democratic Party. But it would not be 1,000% out of the realm of reality, unlike a state like Wyoming or Utah, which will never go to a Democrat likely for decades to come. So Kansas, South Carolina, Alaska, likely Republican states. They also have a couple others. They have states like Iowa and Ohio, states that historically were more competitive. Obama won them twice, Trump won them twice, and now we're up in an election where Donald Trump is likely to win them by a very similar margin to that he did back in 2020. What's most interesting, though, is that these states, looking at the history, have often voted with the winner of the Electoral College. Up until 2020, Ohio had voted correctly in almost every single election since its inception as a U.S. state. But now, it is no longer this everlasting bellwether. Many of the swing bellwether counties really lost their streak and track record in 2020, and it will be interesting to see how Ohio and Iowa perform compared to the national average, because it more likely than not is a state Democrats are not going to win in future elections, which is why I don't even put Kamala Harris within a lean characterization of winning the state, because we know it's a likely red state. Florida is also going to join the bunch as a likely red state as well. This one really shouldn't shock too many people looking at the 2022 election results. Republicans obliterated Democrats in the top ballot and down ballot races. Really strong showing for the Florida GOP. They've been outpacing Democrats in the state in voter registration and voter enthusiasm and swaying over minority voters, specifically Hispanic voters in Miami-Dade and Broward County. And all across the state, really, Florida has seen a monumental shift in favor of Republicans, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of new residents that flocked into Florida during the COVID-19 pandemic to escape what we saw as left-wing policy, states with mask mandates, states with where you saw schools closed or virtual or hybrid, different things that Florida simply did not because of Governor Ron DeSantis. Roughly a 90-10 split of those influxing into Florida in what we saw migration within the United States, we saw a 90-10 split, 80-20 split of party registration and voter sentiment of those who newly moved into the state. So Florida has been a state that has moved away from the Democratic Party. It'll be interesting to see the margin this cycle, but I do think Donald Trump wins it by a likely margin. And so to now get back up into where, actually we have one more thing to characterize as a likely red state, or not even state, but district, Maine's 2nd district right now, which I would say is likely red. Donald Trump won it by double digits before. He will likely get very close again in 2024. Could be 9 points, could be 10, could be 11. Overall, I'm saying it's more than 5. So there we have it. All of the likely and safe Republican states, and now you can start to see why Democrats are coming into this election hoping that they have a few more states that they can help build themselves up to 270 before they really have to get down to the very, very narrow 7 states that truly do determine the outcome of this election. This includes states like Virginia and Colorado, New Mexico, all states that Biden won in the last election by 10 points plus, meaning Democrats have a lot of room to fall. New data out of Nebraska 2nd from Survey USA shows Kamala Harris up 6 points in this district, 5 points in this district rather, 52 to 47, something similar, large amount. Kamala Harris is doing well in Nebraska 2nd. This is a district that actually was gerrymandered to be more Republican than it was in 2020 when it voted for Biden by over 5 this time. Likely to do so as well. Nebraska 2nd has seen a massive leftward trend. I would not be shocked if by the end of this decade, Nebraska 2nd ends up being a double-digit Democratic district in future elections. So right now, that one electoral vote goes to Kamala Harris, but she has her own set of 3 more states that should be characterized as likely blue. To no surprise to really anyone, Maine at large would be characterized as such. But what I'm more focused on are Minnesota and New Hampshire, states where Democrats, again, did very well back in 2020, largely with Biden. Hillary Clinton held on to both of these states in 2016, which did in fact see massive shifts to the Republicans. But it is these 2 states that have really rejected Donald Trump twice. And it is also Minnesota, where Governor Tim Walz is a very popular governor and adds a lot to Kamala Harris's ticket, not only in Minnesota, but across the Rust Belt. These are 2 states that I would say, with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, become likely Democratic states. And so that brings us down to 133 toss-up electoral votes. And so what this really means from here on out is that I expect the margin of victory for either side of the aisle to be less than 5 points in these states. Now, you might be shocked to see Texas on this map. And I will say, if I was to show myself this map when I first started creating videos on this channel in 2017, I would have thought you were crazy. But Texas has taken a turn in favor of the Democratic Party that really means Texas is far closer than we otherwise think. Let's look at it from the perspective of historical elections. Back in 2012, Mitt Romney won the state by 16 points. Now, 8 years prior, we had seen a reduction. George W. Bush won the state by 23. But 8 years later, Mitt Romney was still winning by 16 points. Barack Obama had just 41% of the vote. To put things into context, states like Missouri and Indiana and South Carolina and Alaska and Mississippi and Montana were all closer than Texas was in the 2012 election. Then came 2016, and this is where it really matters. In 2016, we saw Texas, out of all of the states, shift almost the most out of any state. Arizona was up there, California was up there, Utah was massive, but that was because of a third-party involvement in the state. Texas, though, massive, massive improvement for Hillary Clinton, 6.8% shift when everywhere else was shifting to the right. Iowa shifted 15 points, Ohio shifted 11 points, Michigan shifted 10 points, Pennsylvania 6, Wisconsin 8. Texas, though, complete opposite direction. Then, in 2016, compared to 2020, Texas shifted 3 points to the right. And then what happened in 2020, well, I'm sure you might remember if you looked at the results, Trump only won the state by 5.6. What was 15.8 to 9 to 5.6, I do believe at this point we are on track for Texas to be a lean Republican state. Massive one for the GOP, and I don't think Democrats will contest it. But I think we're on track for a lean GOP characterization, and I think with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, that's where we are. Now, down to the 93 toss-up electoral votes, 7 battleground states to determine all: Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Now, if you live in any of these states, I will say I feel bad for you. There have been over a combined $500 million across these 7 battleground states slated in advertisement spending from Democrats and Republicans through November after Labor Day, which is tomorrow, which means you are going to see the airways completely taken over by advertisement after advertisement after advertisement. And that's because it is these 7 battleground states that will determine the future of this nation, the future of the Democratic and Republican parties, a very, very interesting election, a very, very important one in these 7 states. And so coming into them, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have 219 electoral votes. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have 226. Now let's start out where the Trump team really has some of their stronger performances and where I think they are going to do the best in out of these 7 states. To start off, I would go to a state like North Carolina, where we saw Donald Trump and Mike Pence in 2020 win the state by roughly a point and won it by 3 in 2016. This is a state where Democrats, if tapped in and correctly doing it, would be able to win North Carolina. I don't know if that's this election cycle. I do think that because the Biden campaign had been very focused on North Carolina for quite some time, the infrastructure absolutely exists for a strong Democratic performance. But getting over that hurdle, I would honestly compare North Carolina to that of the Republican parties in Nevada, in that historically they've had strong showings, but competitive races that almost always end up with one party winning. For Republicans in Nevada, it's Democrats winning the close and competitive races. For Democrats in North Carolina, it's Republicans winning those close and competitive races. And I do think at this point, we aren't on track for a 2008 style victory. As much as the energy might feel like it on the Democratic side, Republicans are just as energized. And Donald Trump and J.D. Vance at 235 electoral votes with North Carolina isn't really the end of their electoral story, but it does go to show that some of the states that were the weakest links for Kamala Harris, if they were to even be considered links at all, would still remain in the Donald Trump column today. But this can be countered. The 16 electoral votes in North Carolina can absolutely be countered in a state like Michigan, where I think Kamala Harris is going to win by a lean margin. This means anywhere between 1% to 5%. Tilt means less than 1%. Michigan, I think, is going to be very competitive. I still believe that Kamala Harris has seen some bleeding relative to Biden's performance in 2020 and arguably even Hillary Clinton's in 2016, and the respective to the Arab American communities, the Muslim community in states like Michigan, where it really, really matters. You're talking about Dearborn and Detroit, where Democrats are consistently relying on voting bases across the state that in a combined force can elect Democrats across Michigan. Right now, Democrats aren't doing so well. Even though Joe Biden was far more unpopular than that of Vice President Harris, at the end of the day, things are very difficult for Democrats in a state like Michigan. I do think that Gretchen Whitmer laid out a very good blueprint for the Democratic Party as to how to win without consistently winning in the same way that Biden did amongst the same core bases. After all, Gretchen Whitmer did see some reversions in minority support across the board in Michigan, but she ran up the numbers amongst white suburban voters. And believe it or not, what we have found is that in a winning coalition, like a state like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, voting bases can actually sometimes be, counteracted. In one end, we saw in Nevada in 2020 as a perfect example, how Donald Trump made massive gains across the country, not massive, but in context, I would say larger than normal gains for a Republican candidate amongst minority voters and specifically Latino voters. In a state like Nevada, we did see that. But what it was counteracted by in terms of the overall margin shift was a victory amongst white voters that was larger, or even in some cases, a better loss than it was in years prior. And so I think Michigan's a very similar example, where I think Kamala Harris will largely perform roughly even with that of Biden in 2020. And while that may not be a slam dunk victory the Democrats were hoping for, it's still a victory, and it's 15 electoral votes that Kamala Harris can add to her name. Clearly, there is work to be done. But right now, I don't think it spells out an immediate loss for Kamala Harris. I still believe she's more likely to win Michigan than not, but it's a lot closer than Democrats would like it to be. So that brings us down to 62 toss-up electoral votes. Again, Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. And now I think Donald Trump has really gone on to show that he knows how to win in some of these states. In 2016 and 2020, started to see that a little bit walked back. But I do think right now, Kamala Harris is not the favorite in a state like Georgia. My last prediction was the same in Georgia and North Carolina. They both had tilt-red characterizations, and I want to continue to defend this point. Because while the energy is there for Democrats, and they absolutely are contesting the state in a way the Democrats haven't in the past 30 years, That doesn't mean that Georgia is going to go blue, right? 2022, I think, was a wake-up call for many Democrats in Georgia, in that while they were expecting Herschel Walker to lose, and maybe some of them thought he was going to win because of the red wave rhetoric, but after the 2022 midterms, they were hoping that by the time we had reached runoff date, Herschel Walker would have lost by 5-6 points in the same way Blake Masters did, in the same way Dr. Oz did, but it didn't happen. And it didn't happen because Georgia is a state that's very difficult for Democrats to crack. They did it once in 2020, and I think they can do it again in 2024. But as of right now, Donald Trump is the very narrow favorite. Now, moving on by this state, Kamala Harris has been performing surprisingly well in a state like Wisconsin. I think it could be a state that actually votes to the left of Pennsylvania. Wisconsin is a state that has historically been very difficult for Democrats as well. In 2000 and 2004, they were decided by less than a point. It was only 2008 and 2012, with Obama's very broadly winning coalition, that Democrats were able to run up the numbers in Wisconsin. But beyond that, it has been a competitive state. But Kamala Harris's performances in the state have actually seen major improvements compared to that of President Biden, and major improvements compared to many of the other battleground states. Wisconsin, Michigan right now, I'd say, are lean blue. Democrats, I also do think, maintain this narrow upper hand in the state of Arizona. But it is a narrow upper hand, largely driven by the abortion referendum that was just confirmed and certified to be on the ballot this November, and largely driven by the down-ballot benefit for Democrats that Ruben Gallego and many House Democrats now see themselves doing far better and outpacing Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, in some cases, marginally outperforming Kamala Harris at the same rate, I would say, not marginally, at the same rate to that of President Biden, but she does better than Biden, and so the numbers sort of elevate on all the scales for Democrats. But Arizona right now, I'd say arguably, is a Democratic victory. And so that brings us to 262 electoral votes, 25 electoral votes to go, 251 for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. Right now, I think based on a few more data points we've seen out of the state of Nevada, Donald Trump now surges back to be the upper hand candidate in the state of Nevada. It's 6 electoral votes, and it's nothing that Democrats should look at and say, this isn't worth pursuing, but it also isn't worth looking at and saying, if we don't win Nevada, we don't win the election. Well, Nevada's had a long history of voting blue. Since the 2004 election, that was the last time Republicans won it, Democrats have done quite well in the state. But it is clear that that advantage is diminishing, not necessarily quickly, but over time. And in some race, it has to budge. It was the governorship in 2022 that was coinciding with the Senate race where Catherine Cortez Masto, although able to hold out the polls that said the Republicans were going to win, only won by less than a point. I do think Kamala Harris has a strong regional advantage in Nevada and knows how to win in states like Nevada and knows how to win over voters like those in Nevada. At the same time, on a more nationalized scale, I think Nevada becomes a bit more tricky for national Democrats, including Vice President Harris. I think in 2 weeks' time, Kamala Harris could be up in the state. But the data points I've seen over the past 2 weeks aren't exactly that promising, especially in a post-convention bump circumstance that doesn't seem to be phasing out to be reality. However, Nevada and Arizona considered, I still believe Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are the favorites in Pennsylvania. I think the margins will be close in the state, even closer than it was 2 weeks ago. But that doesn't mean Democrats lose. Pennsylvania is a state that if Democrats win it, they more likely than not win the election. The odds we've seen on major forecast websites is that roughly if Trump wins Pennsylvania, he has a 94% chance of winning. If Kamala Harris wins Pennsylvania, she has a 91% chance of winning. Pennsylvania is a state that really does dictate all. It's a large electoral vote sum. It's a state that's very much an indicator of the rest of the nation, and it serves as this litmus test for Democrats not only on the national level, but in the Rust Belt regional level, which is why I think if Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are doing well in Wisconsin and Michigan, as they have all three voted together in every election since 1992, they very well will do so again in this election. And so I think Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin join forces. Lock rank Arizona joins the Democratic column compared to where it was against Biden. But overall, Democrats lose Georgia and Nevada, ultimately bringing Donald Trump to 257 electoral votes, a minor improvement off of my last map, and Kamala Harris at 281, a minor loss compared to the last map. Overall, though, still a victory for the vice president, and good numbers, I should say, in comparison to that of President Biden. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.